Introduction. The greatest show on earth. Morgan Housel once spent his college years parking cars at a hotel in Los Angeles. One regular guest was a technology genius who had patented a piece of Wi-Fi in his 20s, wildly rich and wildly reckless with it. One afternoon he bought a handful of $1,000 gold coins, stood on a dock with his friends, and skipped them into the Pacific like stones, laughing, just for fun. A few years later, he was broke. That image opens the book because it captures the whole argument. Doing well with money has little to do with how smart you are, and almost everything to do with the way you act. And behavior is hard to teach even to geniuses. To prove it, the book sets two lives side by side. Ronald Read was a janitor and a gas station attendant in rural Vermont who swept floors, chopped his own firewood, and quietly bought blue-chip stocks for decades. When he died at 92, he was worth more than $8 million, and left over $6 million of it to his local hospital and library. There was no secret, only patience. His opposite was Richard Fuscone, a Harvard-educated Merrill Lynch executive who retired in his 40s, borrowed heavily to expand a vast mansion in Greenwich, and then went bankrupt in the crash of 2008. One man with no degree outlasted another who had the best of everything. That almost never happens elsewhere. You will never watch a janitor perform a better heart transplant than a trained surgeon. But in money it happens all the time because money is not a hard science. We are taught the opposite. Finance is presented like physics with clean formulas that tell you exactly what to do, when really it runs on emotion and nuance much closer to psychology. The brightest minds pour into the field, and yet there is little proof we have grown any wiser with our own money. Money, in the end, is a soft skill where how you behave matters more than what you know. Housel loves Voltaire's line that history never repeats itself, but man always does. What follows is 20 short chapters on the strange, human ways we think about money. On we go. Chapter 1. No one's crazy. People do some genuinely crazy things with money. But Housel's claim is that no one is actually crazy. Each of us moves through life anchored to a view of how money works that was shaped by our own narrow slice of experience. The generation we were born into, the economy, the job market, the luck we happen to meet. Your personal history is a tiny sliver of everything that has ever happened, and yet it quietly forms most of how you think the world works. Picture how differently two people can see the same thing. Someone who came of age under brutal inflation invests one way. Someone who has never watched prices jump invests another. When the young John Kennedy was asked what he remembered of the Great Depression, he admitted he had no first-hand knowledge of it. His family was so rich that the only sign he ever saw was his father hiring extra gardeners out of charity. He learned about the Depression at Harvard from a book. Two economists, Ulrike Malmendier and Stefan Nagel, combed through 50 years of household data and found that a person's appetite for risk is anchored to whatever the market happened to do when they were young. Not intelligence, not education, just the dumb luck of when you were born. Take lottery tickets. The poorest households in America spend around $400 a year on them, 4 times what the wealthy spend, and many of those same families could not pull together $400 in an emergency. It looks insane. But strain a little and you can hear the logic. When every ordinary dream that finance readers take for granted feels out of reach, a ticket is the only affordable way to hold one. There is a second reason we fumble all of this. The whole game is astonishingly new. The main retirement savings account did not even exist until the late 1970s. We have a few decades of practice with the modern financial system, and we expect to be experts. We are not crazy. We are all just newbies, making choices that genuinely make sense to us in the moment. Chapter 2. Luck and Risk. Bill Gates went to one of the only high schools on Earth that owned a computer. In 1968, a teacher at Lakeside School, just outside Seattle, spent the proceeds of a rummage sale to lease a computer terminal, something most universities did not yet have. Gates was 13, and he could not get enough of it. He later ran the numbers. Of the roughly 300 million high school-age children in the world that year, maybe 300 had access to a machine like that. 1 in a million. If there had been no Lakeside, he told the school decades later, there would have been no Microsoft. But luck has a sibling, and its name is risk. Gates had a best friend named Kent Evans, every bit as gifted and every bit as driven. The two of them schemed endlessly about the companies they would build together. Kent never made it. He died in a mountaineering accident before he finished high school, an event with odds of roughly 1 chance in a million. The same magnitude of chance, running in the opposite direction. Luck and risk are siblings, Housel says, because every outcome in life is guided by forces other than individual effort. You are one person among billions, in a world of infinite moving parts, and the accidental can matter more than anything you deliberately choose. This is what makes judging success so treacherous. Cornelius Vanderbilt bulldozed the law to build his railroads, and history calls it visionary nerve. Enron did the very same, and we call it fraud. Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing, made most of his fortune on a single holding that broke every rule of diversification he himself taught. One lucky break, he admitted, or one shrewd decision, and even he could not tell them apart. The lesson is not despair but humility. Nothing is as good or as bad as it seems. So be careful whom you praise and careful whom you look down on. Study broad patterns rather than dazzling individuals, because the more extreme the story, the more luck and risk shaped it, and the less it can teach you. When things go well, leave room for luck. When they go badly, leave room for risk and forgive yourself accordingly. Chapter 3. Never Enough. At a party thrown by a billionaire, the writer Kurt Vonnegut needled his friend Joseph Heller. Their host, he pointed out, had made more money in a single day than Heller had earned from his famous novel in its entire history. Heller's reply became legend. Yes, he said, but I have something he will never have. Enough. Enough. It is the hardest idea in money. And the chapter is built on 2 men who never found it. Rajat Gupta climbed from the slums of Kolkata to run McKinsey, the most prestigious consulting firm in the world, and was worth $100 million. It was not enough. He wanted entry to the billionaire's circle, so, sitting on the board of Goldman Sachs, he leaked secret news of Warren Buffett's rescue investment to a hedge fund manager seconds after hearing it, and went to prison. Then there is Bernie Madoff, whose name is now a synonym for fraud. What people forget is that long before the Ponzi scheme, Madoff ran a legitimate firm that earned tens of millions of dollars a year. He was already rich, already respected, and he threw it all away. There is no sense in men who have everything risking it for more, except that they had no sense of enough. Buffett said it plainly. To get money they did not have and did not need, they risked what they did have and did need, and that is just foolish. The trap is wired into us. Modern capitalism is brilliant at generating wealth and generating envy at the same time, and the goalpost keeps sliding away, so each step forward only resets the finish line further off. Social comparison is a war you can never win, because there is always a higher rung. The rookie envies the star envies the hedge fund manager, who envies Buffett, who could envy Bezos. The only way to win is to refuse to play. Reputation, freedom, family, being loved by the people you want to love you. These things are invaluable, and the surest way to keep them is to know when you have enough and stop reaching. Chapter 4. Confounding Compounding. Start with the Ice Ages. For a long time no one could explain why the planet had frozen over and thawed 5 separate times. The energy involved is staggering, so surely the cause had to be staggering too. It wasn't. A Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovic traced the cycles to slight, regular shifts in the Earth's tilt toward the sun, and a Russian meteorologist, Vladimir Koppen, found the real trigger hidden in the detail. Not brutal winters, but mild summers. A summer merely cool enough to leave a little snow unmelted lets the next winter build on it, and the next until, in a geological blink, a thin layer becomes a continent of ice. It is not the amount of snow that matters, one glaciologist said, but the fact that it lasts. That is compounding, and money obeys the same quiet law. More than 2,000 books dissect how Warren Buffett built his fortune, and nearly all of them miss the simplest fact about it. Buffett is worth around $84 billion, and the overwhelming majority of that arrived after his 60th birthday. He began investing as a child and simply never stopped. Run the experiment. Had he started in his 30s and retired at 60 with those very same brilliant returns, he would be worth not $84 billion but around $12 million. His skill is investing, but his secret is time. Compare him to Jim Simons, whose fund has compounded at 66% a year, a far better rate than Buffett's 22%, and yet Simons is markedly less rich because he did not find his stride until he was 50. The years are everything. Our minds fight this because we think in straight lines while compounding bends. 8 added to itself 9 times is 72. 8 multiplied by itself 9 times is more than 100 million. So good investing is not about earning the very highest returns, which tend to be one-off flukes. It is about earning decent returns you can repeat for the longest stretch of time. That is when compounding turns the quiet and ordinary into something extraordinary. Chapter 5. Getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. There are countless ways to get rich, but only one way to stay rich. Some blend of frugality and paranoia. 2 traders make the point. Jesse Livermore was the most famous speculator of his age. On the darkest day of the 1929 crash, reports of ruined speculators were spreading across New York. Livermore walked through his door and faced his terrified wife. Then he told her the truth. He had bet against the market and had just made the equivalent of $3 billion in a single day. That same week, a real estate millionaire named Abraham Germansky, wiped out by the very same crash, was last seen tearing a strip of ticker tape to shreds on Wall Street and was never found again. One man triumphant, one destroyed. But move ahead 4 years and Livermore, drunk on his own success, kept making bigger and bigger bets, lost everything, and eventually took his own life. He was brilliant at getting wealthy and hopeless at keeping it, and those, the book insists, are 2 entirely different skills. Getting money takes optimism and a willingness to risk. Keeping it takes the opposite: humility, frugality, and a quiet fear that whatever luck handed you can be snatched straight back. If financial success had to shrink to a single word, that word would be survival. Consider Rick Guerin, who invested beside Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger in the early years and was every bit as sharp. But Rick was in a hurry. He leaned on borrowed money, got caught in a downturn, and was forced to sell his shares to Buffett for a pittance. Buffett and Munger simply never had to sell. They survived, and surviving is what let compounding do its slow, patient work. The shape of all this is a mind that is optimistic and paranoid at once. Confident the future trends upward, while certain the road there is mind. Build in room for error. Plan, above all, on your plan not going to plan so that a single bad break can never knock you out of the game. Chapter 6. Tails, You Win. Heinz Berggruen fled Nazi Germany as a young man and became one of the greatest art dealers who ever lived. In the year 2000 he sold a slice of his collection, Picasso's, Klay's, Matisse's, to the German government for more than 100 million euros, and they treated it almost as a gift because the real value ran past $1 billion. It is tempting to ask how one person could spot that many masterpieces. The honest answer is that he didn't. He bought art in enormous quantities like an index fund, and then waited for a handful of winners to emerge. Perhaps 99% of what he bought was worth little, but if the other 1% turns out to be a Picasso, you can be wrong almost all of the time and still end up stupendously right. That is the power of tails. In finance, a tiny number of events drives the overwhelming majority of outcomes. Walt Disney made hundreds of cartoons through the 1930s and lost money on most of them. Then a single film, Snow White, earned a fortune and rebuilt the entire company. One picture out of hundreds was all that mattered. The same pattern hides inside a boring stock index. When one bank studied the Russell 3000, it found that 40% of the companies in it lost most of their value and never recovered, while a mere 7% of them generated essentially all of the gains. And this is not only about your portfolio, it is about your behavior. Housel imagines a steady investor named Sue who keeps buying through every recession, against two others who panic and sell. Across a century, Sue ends up with far more, because what decides your success is not the years on cruise control but how you act in the rare, terrifying moments when everyone else loses their head. Napoleon defined a military genius as the one who can do the ordinary thing while all around him are going mad. Buffett owned hundreds of stocks and made most of his money on roughly 10 of them. Tails drive everything, so it is perfectly normal for most things to fail. Chapter 7. Freedom. The highest form of wealth, Housel says, is the ability to wake up and say, I can do whatever I want today. People chase money expecting it to buy happiness, and happiness is a slippery thing, but if there is one common thread, it is the feeling of being in control of your own life. A psychologist named Angus Campbell spent his career hunting for what actually makes people happy, and his answer was not income, geography, or education. It was a strong sense of controlling one's life, a more dependable predictor of well-being than any other condition he could measure. So the greatest gift of money is not the things it buys. It is the control it hands you over your own time. Housel learned this the hard way. In college, he wanted nothing but to be an investment banker, certain the money would make him happy. He won the internship, walked in, and discovered why bankers are paid so well. They work hours no human should. He loved the work itself and still lasted only a month, because doing something you love on a schedule you cannot control feels exactly like doing something you hate. Set that against the entrepreneur Derek Sivers, who lived on almost nothing, saved $12,000, and quit his job to play music at 22. People later asked him about the day he sold his company, but he waved it away. That was merely more money in the bank. The real change, he said, came the moment he became free. And here is the puzzle. America is the richest nation in history, yet barely happier than it was in the 1950s. We poured our new wealth into bigger houses and faster cars, and quietly handed back our control over our time, because so many modern jobs now follow us home inside our heads. A gerontologist named Carl Pillemer interviewed 1,000 elderly Americans about life's deepest lessons, and not one of them said the secret was to work as hard as possible for money. They spoke of friendships, of belonging, of unhurried time with their children. Your kids, one of them said, do not want your money, they want you. Chapter 8. Man in the Car Paradox. Back when Housel parked cars for a living, he dreamed of owning a Ferrari of his own, certain it would broadcast to the world that he had finally made it. Then he caught himself doing something revealing. When a gleaming sports car rolled up, he never once thought, look how cool that driver is. He thought, look how cool I would seem behind that wheel. Everyone does this. We buy beautiful things to be admired by other people, and yet those other people rarely admire the owner at all. They look straight past you and picture themselves in the driver's seat. That is the paradox. You buy the car to gather respect, while the onlooker uses that very car as the backdrop for their own daydream of being respected. The man waving from behind the wheel believes the world is gazing at him, when really it is gazing at the car and imagining someone else inside it. None of this means you cannot enjoy nice things. Housel likes them too. It is a quieter recognition. If what you truly want is to be respected, expensive metal buys far less of it than you imagine. Humility, kindness, and empathy will earn you more regard than horsepower ever will. Chapter 9. Wealth is what you don't see. Money hides a strange irony at its heart. Real wealth is the wealth you cannot see. When Housel was a valet, a young man he calls Roger drove a Porsche, and that was enough for everyone to assume he was rich. Then one day Roger turned up in a beaten old Honda. The Porsche, he explained without a flicker of embarrassment, had been repossessed when he stopped making the payments. Every assumption people had made about him was wrong. The truth is that a person in a $100,000 car might be wealthy, but the only fact you really know is that they now have $100,000 less than before, or $100,000 more in debt. We judge wealth by what we can see, because the cars and the houses and the photographs are all we are ever shown. Yet wealth is precisely the opposite. Wealth is the cars not bought, the upgrades declined, the money that stayed invested instead of being turned into things. The singer Rihanna nearly went broke from overspending and sued her advisor, who replied, with perfect logic, that if you spend money on things you will end up with the things and not the money. When most people say they want to be a millionaire, what they often mean is that they would like to spend $1 million, which is the exact opposite of being one. This is also why wealth is so hard to learn. We learn by imitation, and you simply cannot imitate what is invisible. Ronald Read, the janitor worth millions, became a financial hero only after he died, because while he lived not a soul could see what he had quietly built. The world is full of people who look modest and are secretly rich, and people who look rich and live one paycheck from ruin. Remember that before you envy either one. Chapter 10. Save money. Here is the first surprising idea. Building wealth has almost nothing to do with your income or your investment returns, and almost everything to do with your savings rate. Housel makes the case through energy. In the 1970s, the world seemed to be running out of oil, and yet the crisis passed, not mainly because we found more oil, but because we learned to use far less of it. America now draws $1 of output from 60% less energy than it did in 1950. We grew our energy wealth not by drilling more, but by needing less. Money behaves the same way. Investment returns are uncertain and largely beyond your control. Your frugality is finance's version of efficiency, and it is almost entirely within your control. Wealth is simply what is left over after you spend what you take in, and you can build it without a high income but never without a high rate of saving. The deeper trick is that, past a certain point, what you spend is mostly a reflection of ego, an urge to show other people that you have money. So one of the most powerful ways to save more is not to earn more, but to want less, and you want less the moment you stop caring what other people think of you. Savings, seen that way, is the gap between your ego and your income. And you do not actually need a reason to save. Saving with no particular goal is the best kind, because it quietly buys something money rarely buys: flexibility and control over your time. In a world grown hyper-connected, where being merely smart no longer sets anyone apart, the freedom to wait for the right opportunity, to change direction, to move at your own pace, has become one of the most valuable currencies there is. Chapter 11. Reasonable greater than rational. You are not a spreadsheet. You are a person, an emotional, sometimes irrational person, and Housel argues you should stop trying to be coldly rational with money and aim instead to be merely reasonable, because a reasonable plan is one you can actually stick with, and sticking with it is what matters most. He opens with a doctor who fought one disease by deliberately inducing another. In the early 1900s, Julius Wagner-Jahreg noticed that syphilis patients sometimes recovered after a raging fever, so he began infecting them with mild malaria to bring one on. It was brutal and some patients died, but it worked often enough to win him a Nobel Prize. Fevers genuinely help the body fight infection. And yet almost all of us reach for a pill the instant a fever starts because fevers hurt and we do not want to hurt. It may be rational to want a fever. It is simply not reasonable. Money is full of the very same gap. Harry Markowitz won a Nobel Prize for the mathematics of the optimal portfolio, and then split his own savings evenly between stocks and bonds, just to minimize the regret he would feel either way. Not optimal on paper, but deeply human and right for him. One famous study showed that borrowing $2 for every one of your own to buy stocks while young would, on average, leave you richer in retirement. The math holds. But no real person could watch their whole account wiped out and calmly carry on, so the strategy is absurd in practice. This is why Housel offers a strange piece of advice. Love your investments. Cold detachment sounds rational, but if it makes you abandon a good strategy the moment it struggles, then the warmth that keeps you holding on is the real edge. The reasonable investor who sticks around beats the rational one who quits. Even Jack Bogle, the patron saint of cheap index funds, put some of his own money into his son's expensive fund. We do some things for family reasons, he shrugged. Life is not always consistent. Chapter 12. Surprise. A Stanford professor named Scott Sagan once said a line worth hanging on the wall. Things that have never happened before happen all the time. History is mostly the study of surprising events, and yet we keep using it as a confident map of the future. Housel calls this the historians as prophets fallacy, leaning on past data to forecast a world whose very lifeblood is change. The trouble is that investing is not a hard science. A kidney works the same in this century as the last, but markets are millions of people making emotional decisions. As the physicist Feynman once joked, imagine how much harder physics would be if electrons had feelings. Well, investors have feelings, plenty of them. The events that matter most are the giant surprises, the ones with no precedent, which is exactly why no one sees them coming. Picture the 20th century without just 7 people: Hitler, Stalin, Mao, the assassin Gavrilo Princip, Edison, Gates, and Martin Luther King. A vanishingly small fraction of humanity bent the direction of the whole world. And these shocks cascade in ways no model could trace. The hijackers of September 11th pushed the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates, which inflated the housing bubble, which triggered the financial crisis, which drove millions into college and a mountain of student debt. When Daniel Kahneman was asked what investors should learn when their forecasts fail, he gave the cleanest answer in the book. The correct lesson from surprises is that the world is surprising. There is a second trap. The world keeps changing structurally, so old data quietly expires. Benjamin Graham wrote the most revered investing book ever published, full of precise formulas, and he himself discarded and rewrote those formulas edition after edition, because what worked yesterday stopped working the moment everyone knew it. The further back you reach for data, the more you are studying a world that no longer exists. So use history for the things that never change, like how people behave under greed and fear, and hold its specifics loosely, because the future is reliably going to surprise you. Chapter 13. Room for Error. Some of the sharpest financial thinking hides in an unlikely place: the blackjack tables of Las Vegas. A skilled card counter never knows which card is coming, only the shifting odds, and so the whole craft rests on humility. You bet a little more when the odds tilt your way, a little less when they don't, and you never, ever push every chip forward because a single wrong turn could end the night. You have to leave yourself room for error. Benjamin Graham gave the idea its name, the margin of safety, and his finest description of it was that the purpose of a margin of safety is to render the forecast unnecessary. That one line carries enormous weight. Almost everything about money lives in a world of odds rather than certainties, and the only safe way through it is to widen the gap between what you expect and what might actually happen. Room for error even protects you from the things you could never imagine. At Stalingrad, the largest battle in history, a German tank unit was suddenly needed at the front, and barely 20 of its 100-odd tanks would start. Field mice had crept inside during the quiet weeks and chewed through the electrical wiring. The most advanced army on Earth undone by mice. No one plans for mice. But strange, unforeseeable things happen constantly, and they do the most harm precisely because you had no plan for them. The defense is to avoid any single point of failure. A jet carries 4 redundant electrical systems for the same reason, and the biggest such weakness in money is leaning entirely on a paycheck with no savings behind it. Above all, take risk to get ahead, but never the kind of risk that can wipe you out. The odds in Russian roulette sit in your favor. The downside still makes it insane. Leverage is the quiet thing that turns an ordinary risk into a fatal one. And save without needing a reason, because the most important part of any plan is planning on the plan not going to plan. Chapter 14. You'll change. Housel grew up with a friend who had neither money nor obvious talent, only ferocious drive. The friend's lifelong dream was to become a doctor, against odds nobody rated, and a full decade behind his classmates, he made it. Years later Housel called to catch up, and before he could finish saying hello, his friend cut in. Awful career. Awful career, man. The hours and the stress had ground him down, and he was as miserable in the life he had fought for as he had once been desperate to reach it. The lesson underneath is that human beings are poor forecasters of their own future selves. Imagining a goal is easy and thrilling. Living inside that goal, with all its real stresses, is another thing entirely. Picture the boy who wants only to drive a tractor, who becomes the teenager set on law school, who becomes the lawyer who never sees his family, who becomes the stay-at-home parent, who at 70 cannot afford to retire. We wander because what we want keeps shifting. Psychologists call this the end-of-history illusion. We vividly remember how much we have already changed, yet we feel certain we will never change again. Daniel Gilbert showed it holds at every age. People from 18 to 68 all underestimate how much they have left to become. This is why extreme money plans backfire. Bet everything on a life of near poverty, or on chasing every last dollar, and you raise the odds of waking one day in deep regret, because the thrill of either extreme wears off while its costs only harden. The wiser path is balance at every stage of life. Moderate saving, moderate leisure, moderate time with the people you love, so a plan can survive your own changing mind. And when your goals truly do shift, drop the old one without guilt. Kahneman folded that into his genius with 3 quiet words about his own work. I have no sunk costs. The faster you release a stale plan, the sooner you can get back to compounding. Chapter 15. Nothing's free. Everything has a price, and the trick with money is recognizing what that price is and agreeing to pay it. The catch is that the tag stays hidden until the bill arrives. General Electric was the most valuable company in the world in 2004, and then it came apart. Its finance arm imploded in the crisis, and its stock fell from $40 to $7. As the blame rained down, the departing chief executive, Jeff Immelt, offered one honest line. Every job looks easy when you're not the one doing it. The same holds for investing. The American market has compounded at roughly 11% a year for generations, which sounds like free money, until you remember what you had to endure to collect it. The greatest stocks demand the steepest tolls. Netflix returned tens of thousands of percent over 16 years, and still traded below its previous high on 94% of days. That is the price of admission, and it hurts. Most people try to dodge it. They trade in and out, hoping to pocket the returns while skipping the volatility, the financial equivalent of stealing the car instead of buying it. It rarely works. When Morningstar studied the funds built to time the market, almost none beat a simple buy-and-hold mix, and by trying to avoid the price, investors usually end up paying double. Here is the shift that fixes it. When your portfolio drops, it doesn't feel like a fee for something good. It feels like a fine, a punishment for doing something wrong, and our instinct is to dodge future fines. But a ticket to Disneyland costs $100 and nobody calls that a punishment. It buys a day you will never forget. Market volatility is the same kind of cost. A fee, not a fine, the admission price for returns that cash and bonds will never pay. Convince yourself the fee is worth it, and you can finally stay in your seat long enough to enjoy the ride. Find the price, then pay it. Chapter 16. You and me. When the dot-com bubble burst, it erased more than $6 trillion of household wealth, and the housing bust took even more. Bubbles ruin lives, and we never seem to learn, but Housel offers a cause that usually goes unnoticed. Investors innocently take their cues from other investors who are playing an entirely different game. The damage starts with a single innocent idea, that an asset has one correct price. It doesn't, because the right price depends entirely on your time horizon. A fair price for someone holding a stock 30 years is nonsense to a day trader who only needs it to rise before lunch, and both of them can be right at once. When a stock has momentum, short-term traders pile in reasonably to ride it for the hours they need, and as they push the price up, they pull in still more traders until the people setting the price are almost all short-term players. In 1999, the stock of Cisco quadrupled to a value of $600 billion, a level at which, one economist noted, it would have to grow larger than the entire American economy within 2 decades. The day traders did not care. They would be gone by the afternoon. But a long-term investor watching everyone else buy at that price thinks maybe they know something I don't, and quietly adopts a price that is a disaster for anyone planning to hold for years. That is the trap. 2 investors on the same field, running blindly toward each other, until they collide and someone gets hurt. When a voice on television tells you to buy a stock, it has no idea who you are. A teenager trading for fun, a retiree on a fixed income, a fund manager dressing up the books before the quarter ends. So the single most protective thing you can do is to know which game you are actually playing, and refuse to be moved by people playing another. Housel wrote his own down. A passive investor, optimistic about the world's growth over the coming 30 years. Everything outside that one sentence, he realized, belongs to a game he is not playing. Chapter 17. The Seduction of Pessimism. Optimism is the smart bet because for most people the world tends to get better most of the time, and yet pessimism holds a special grip on us. It simply sounds smarter. Tell someone everything will be fine and they shrug. Warn them of danger and you have their complete attention. In the darkest days of 2008, the most respected financial newspaper in the world ran a front-page forecast by a Russian professor that the United States would soon shatter into 6 pieces, with Alaska reverting to Russia and California falling under Chinese control. It was treated as serious analysis. Now flip it around. Imagine a writer in defeated, famished Japan in 1946 predicting that the country would grow 15-fold and become the envy of the world. They would have been sent for a medical evaluation, even though that is precisely what happened. Doom reads as wisdom. Hope reads as naivety. As John Stuart Mill noticed long ago, it is the man who despairs when others hope who is admired as a sage. Several forces make financial gloom so seductive. Money touches everyone, so a threat to it seizes everyone at once. Pessimists also tend to extrapolate today's trend in a straight line, forgetting that markets adapt. When an environmentalist warned in 2008 that the world was running out of oil, the soaring prices triggered a fracking boom that more than doubled American output instead. And above all, progress is slow while ruin is sudden. The Wright brothers flew, and for years almost no one noticed or believed it, while a single plane crash made headlines overnight. Heart disease deaths have quietly fallen by 70% since the 1960s, saving a city's worth of lives every year. Yet that miracle is far too gradual to feel like news. Growth compounds in silence. Destruction arrives in an instant. When the paralyzed physicist Stephen Hawking was asked how he stayed so cheerful, he said his expectations had been cut to 0 at 21, so everything since was a bonus. Low expectations, it turns out, are the surest path to being pleasantly surprised, which is, ironically, a fine reason to be optimistic. Chapter 18. When you'll believe anything. Picture an alien sent to watch our economy from above New York. He hovers over the city on New Year's Eve of 2007, and again 2 years later, and from his height almost nothing has changed. The same factories, the same offices and desks, the same universities handing out the same degrees, the same knowledge and the same tools. If anything, the technology has improved. And yet, on paper, American households are $16 trillion poorer, 10 million more people are out of work, and the stock market is worth half what it was. The alien cannot make sense of it. The one thing he could not see was the only thing that changed: the story people told themselves about the economy. In 2007, they believed in rising house prices and prudent banks. In 2009, they stopped believing, and that collapse of faith alone tipped the world into its worst slump in 80 years. Stories, Housel argues, are the most powerful force in the economy, the fuel that lets everything run, or the brake that holds it all back. And we are most vulnerable to a story exactly when we want it to be true. He calls these appealing fictions. A Yemeni father, watching his son suffer with no money and no real doctor, let the village elders burn the boy's chest with a hot stick, and afterward he said it plainly. When you have no money and your son is sick, you'll believe anything. The same hunger runs through money. Bernie Madoff raised billions from sophisticated investors because he told a story they wanted to hear. Each of us carries an incomplete picture of the world and quietly fills the gaps with a confident tale, mistaking hindsight for real understanding. A trip to Pluto can be forecast to the minute, but money is not physics, and pretending that it is only deepens the illusion. The defense is humility, and a margin of room for error wide enough to survive being wrong. Chapter 19. All Together Now. This chapter ties the threads together, and Housel opens it with a warning about giving advice. In 1931, a man named Clarence Hughes went under for dental surgery and woke to find 16 teeth pulled and his tonsils gone, none of which he had agreed to. He died a week later, and his widow sued, not because the surgery was botched, but because no one ever asked him. For most of history, a doctor's job was simply to fix the patient, whatever the patient happened to think. Only in recent decades did medicine shift toward laying out the options and letting the person choose, because people value wildly different things. Financial advice, Housel says, is exactly the same. He cannot tell you what to do with your money, because he does not know you what you want when you want it or why. So instead he offers principles. Seek humility when things go right and compassion when they go wrong, because nothing is ever as good or as bad as it looks. Remember that saving is the gap between your ego and your income, so less ego quietly becomes more wealth. Manage your money in the way that lets you sleep at night, not the way that earns the highest return, but the one that keeps you calm. If you want to invest better, the single most powerful lever is to lengthen your time horizon. Make your peace with many things going wrong, since a small handful of winners carry the whole. Use money to buy control over your time, the highest dividend in all of finance. Save without needing a reason. Treat volatility as a fee, not a fine. And above all, respect the mess. Smart, reasonable people will always disagree about money, because there is no single right answer, only the one that works for you. Chapter 20. Confessions. A billionaire investor named Sandy Gottesman interviews candidates for his team with a single question. What do you own and why? Not which stock looks cheap, not which economy is about to turn. Just show me what you actually do with your own money. Housel loves it because there is so often a wide gap between what people advise and what they do. Half of all mutual fund managers, he points out, do not put a single dollar of their own money into their funds. That is not necessarily hypocrisy. It is a reminder that money decisions are personal, made at the dinner table, not in a textbook. So Housel confesses his own. His goal has never really been to be rich. It has been to be independent, to wake each day and do what he wants on his own terms. He watched his father become a doctor at 40, save hard for 2 decades, and then simply walk away from a brutal emergency room career because he could finally afford to. That is the freedom Housel is chasing. He and his wife locked in a modest lifestyle in their 20s and never let it swell, so almost every raise since has flowed straight into savings. They own their home outright with no mortgage, the worst decision on a spreadsheet and the best for how it makes them feel. And they hold far more cash than any advisor would counsel because cash is the oxygen of independence, and they never want to be forced to sell their investments at the wrong moment. As for investing, he began as a stock picker and ended up moving everything into low-cost index funds, trusting a high savings rate, patience, and optimism over cleverness. None of this is the one right answer. It is simply his. And the book closes on the very line it opened with, "No one is crazy." Postscript, a brief history of why the United States consumer thinks the way they do. To understand how people think about money today, Housel closes with a sweeping story of the American consumer. When the Second World War ended, 16 million soldiers came home to no clear jobs, and policymakers feared a slide straight back into depression. So the country made a deliberate choice. It pinned interest rates near the floor, opened cheap mortgages to veterans through the GI Bill, and unleashed consumer credit. The first credit card arrived in 1950. Spending became, quite literally, an economic strategy. And it worked spectacularly. Pent-up demand met a hidden surge of productivity, and the 1950s boomed. What made that boom unusual is that the country, as Housel puts it, got rich by making the poor less poor. Wages doubled and then doubled again, the gap between rich and poor narrowed, and lifestyles converged. The wealthy man and the working man drove similar cars, watched the same 3 television channels, and lived lives the other could recognize. Then, around 1973, the machine began to crack, and after 1980 growth returned but ran into very different pockets. From the early 90s on, the incomes of the top 1% raced ahead while nearly everyone else crawled. Yet the old post-war expectation had not died, the belief that a banker and a bank teller should live more or less alike. So the people whose incomes had stalled stretched to keep up: bigger mortgages, leased cars, credit card debt. Household debt climbed from around 60% of income to more than 130% by 2007, until, like a cartoon character who has run off the cliff and finally looks down, the whole thing fell in the crisis of 2008. The lesson Housel draws is the quiet engine beneath the entire book. Expectations move slower than reality. People clung to a 1950s picture of fairness long after the economy stopped delivering it, and that gap between what they expected and what they got curdled into anger. He is not pessimistic. Economics runs in cycles and things come and go. But expectations are slow, so the sense that something is broken may linger a while. History, after all, is just one thing after another.